Hey guys, we are continuing on with Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger. We left off on chapter 15, An Elephant in Wayside School. The bell rang for recess and the children exploded out of the building. Louis, the yard teacher, was ready with a big pile of red and green balls. The kids called, "Hi, Louis," and "Over here, Louis," as he tossed the balls to them. Over his shoulder, behind his back, through his legs. Dee Dee came charging out of the building. Usually by the time she got to the playground, there were no good balls left, but she could see one red ball by Louis's foot. She knocked over a kid from the 10th floor and shouted, "Hey, Lou!" Suddenly she stopped. She had just remembered where she'd heard of Mrs. Drizzle. It was from Louis. He had once told her about the meanest teacher he'd ever had when he was a kid. She hurried over to her friends to make sure. "Hey, Todd," she called. Todd was playing tetherball with Ron. As he turned to look at Dee Dee, the ball came around and bonked him on the head. "Do you remember when Louis told us about the meanest teacher he ever had?" asked Dee Dee. Todd shook his head. After being conked by the tetherball, he couldn't remember anything. "I remember," said Jason, who was in line to play. "Whenever Louis got in trouble, the teacher used to put the waste paper basket on his head." "That's right," said Jenny. "And then Louis would have to keep it there the rest of the day, and everyone would laugh at him. And then the teacher would call on him to answer questions from the blackboard, but he couldn't see the questions, so she'd give him an F." "Do you remember the teacher's name?" asked Dee Dee. Her friends shook their heads. Todd couldn't even remember his own name. "I think it was Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee. They ran to Louis. "Hey, Louis," said Jason. "What was the name of that mean teacher you once had when you were a kid?" "Which one?" asked Louis. "The one that put the trash can on your head," said Jenny. Louis shuddered just thinking about her. "Mrs. Drizzle," he whispered. The kids looked at each other. "What color hair did she have?" asked Jason. "Brown," said Louis. "Why?" "We have a substitute teacher," explained Dee Dee. "She's real nice." "Good," said Louis. "Her name is Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee. "Whoa, I'm getting out of here," said Louis. He started to run, but the kids grabbed him. "It's okay," said Jenny. "It can't be the same teacher. Our teacher is nice." "And her hair isn't brown," said Jason. "It's white." Louis relaxed a little bit. "You want to come up and meet her?" asked Dee Dee. "No way," said Louis. "Oh, you're so silly, Louis," said Dee Dee. "She's not the same teacher. And besides, you're a teacher now, too." "Oh, yeah, I forgot," said Louis. "Come on, Louis," said Dee Dee. She held his hand and led him up the stairs. They entered the classroom. Mrs. Drizzle was putting some of the children's work on the bulletin board. "Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee, "we brought our yard teacher up to meet you." "It's very nice to meet you," said Mrs. Drizzle as she pinned up Joe's arithmetic test. "Exercise is so important for young minds and bodies." She turned around. Louis's face paled. "Well, it was nice to meet you," he said very quickly. "I gotta go. Bye." "Stay right where you are, Louis," ordered Mrs. Drizzle. He froze. Mrs. Drizzle slowly walked to her desk. She picked up the old blue notebook. "The notebook," whispered Louis. Mrs. Drizzle opened it and flipped through the pages. "Here we are," she said. She removed a piece of paper and handed it to Louis. "Is this your homework?" she asked. Louis looked at it. "You were supposed to copy it over, weren't you?" asked Mrs. Drizzle. "That was over 15 years ago," said Louis. "I don't remember." "I do," said Mrs. Drizzle. "Oh, now I remember," said Louis. "I was going to copy it over, but then my pencil point broke, so I went to sharpen it, but the pencil sharpener fell on my foot, so I had to go to the hospital." "I don't want any of your famous excuses, Louis," said Mrs. Drizzle. "I just want the homework. You may share Dee Dee's desk." Louis sat next to Dee Dee. "And remember, Louis," said Mrs. Drizzle, "I know your tricks." Dee Dee watched Louis struggle with his homework. "Sorry, Louis," she said. "Don't be sorry," said Mrs. Drizzle. "It's for his own good. And I expect neatness, Louis, or else you'll just have to do it again." He frowned. Mrs. Drizzle stood over him and watched him work. "Your fingernails are filthy," she said. I'm the yard teacher, Louis tried to explain. I spend a lot of time outside in the grass and dirt and stuff. I don't want excuses, said Mrs. Drizzle. I want clean fingernails. And while you're at it, shave off that mustache. It looks like a hairy caterpillar crawling across your face. Not my mustache, said Louis. Unless you want me to rip it off for you, said Mrs. Drizzle. Oh man. Dee Dee felt terrible. I can't believe Mrs. Drizzle still remembers you after all this time, she said. An elephant never forgets, muttered Louis. I heard that, said Mrs. Drizzle. She put the waste paper basket on Louis's head. That ends. I guess Louis was right. That was Mrs. Drizzle. All right. Next, we are reading chapter 16. I'm not going to tell you guys the chapter name until we read that one. Bye.